Hey, this is Lindsay here. Apologies, I know a few people have probably been waiting for this. If you haven't been checking out the channel lately, I have been releasing an individual bike breakdown on each motorcycle from the shootout, and this is the last one I have left to publish. We've got the 2020 Husqvarna FC 450 sitting here behind me. It's the last one up on deck to talk about. Like I said, so we have all the rest of them posted. If you're looking for any information about the other 4 bikes from this test, there's an individual video up on each one of those, plus the original around 13-minute shootout video with the quick pros and cons and how the bikes fell where they did for the final ranking video. That's been up now for a couple weeks. Super stoked. That broke over 300,000 views pretty quickly, so big thank you to everybody watching, everybody who's been subscribing, commenting, asking questions, etc. So, like I said, we're going to go ahead and jump into this one. But real quick before we do that, I want to once again thank everybody that made this shootout happen. Fox, setting up all the riders head to toe and gear. Oakley for all the awesome goggles. Shopro Motorsports is a huge part of my channel, big supporter. For anybody that's gonna ask, they do sell 5 out of the 6 brands. This is actually the only one they do not have the major motorcycle brands. So we did source this from AEO Powersports. Big thank you to Jeremy there. They have a new shop in Marietta. He helped me out get this one, where the other 5 came from Chaparral. Like I said, Chap's a huge supporter of my channel, so go to chapmoto.com, throw in the code ML512 at checkout to save yourself a little bit off your next purchase, whether it's parts, gears, accessory, etc. A few smaller companies on here, DCMX Tools. Down there's a great guy, Snap-on dealer. If you're looking for any motocross tool or any tools for going to the track, hit him up. There's going to be a link down below for his Instagram. Give him a follow or something. Epoxy SoCal, another local moto company here in SoCal that kind of helps support and make this happen. And then lastly, Dunlop set us up with brand new tires all the way around for all the bikes, MX33s. It's the most common tire used at motocross tracks on the market, so we needed to be able to keep the bikes on fresh rubber all the time and have a nice comparable surface, so they helped out and made that happen. So big thank to them. Specialized Vista Design for the graphics, Works Connection stands. Thank you, everybody made this happen. So let's get into this. If you've been watching the others, like I said, you should know where this bike actually fell in the final rankings. But finally, the Husqvarna did land 3rd overall in this year's shootout. Yamaha was the winner. The Honda was 2nd, 7 points total for the Yamaha, 10 points total for the Honda. The Husky came in with 3rd with 17 points. The KX was 18 points just right behind it. And then the KTM, its brethren bike, was actually in 5th with 23 points. And what we mean by points is each rider scores them from 1st to 6th on the personal list, and we add that together, the lowest score wins. So the Husky got a 4, 3, a 4, and then 2/3 again. In this video, I'm going to go ahead and go through the pros and cons of the bike a little bit deeper, and then we're actually going to get into a few of the riders' individual comments, tell you which one rated which where, you know, a little bit about that rider to give you a little bit deeper information. But overall, this bike scored well with 3/3 and 2/4 right there on the podium. Just a very nice rounded result. Nothing too crazy about it, and that kind of shows what guys thought of the bike. It was a very easy bike to set up from track to track. Nothing really stood out about the bike on the bad side, but nothing stood out about it very much on the good side. That's what riders kept saying, is across all 3 different tracks we rode, everybody just had a very rounded opinion of this machine. They just felt like, you know, it was easy, like I said, a little bit easier to set up, but also kind of mellow in certain aspects. Not the bike that maybe had the most aggressive handling characteristic, and it just didn't shine in a lot of situations, and that's where riders really struggled on where to place it, because it felt fine on it, but just nothing made them grasp for it, and that's kind of where it ended up towards the bottom of that podium list. So talking about some of the good points of it, the bike is physically extremely light, 2nd lightest in the class, only a pound heavier than the KTM. Compared to some of the bikes in class full of fuel, it's 12, 14 pounds lighter. So from physicality, very easy to ride machine in that sense. So good high quality components, the Brembo brakes, the hydro clutch if you're into it. I personally prefer the Magura unit on this a little bit over the Brembo. The engagement distance and that engagement feel to me is a little bit better on this. It's not quite as much of a light switch as the Brembo unit is. But talking about, you know, where some of the downfalls are, motor is the biggest one. We talked about it a bit with the KTM. It's a very mellow machine, and this one is the mellowest of all the bikes here in terms of delivery and character. It's very slow revving, a little bit lethargic, takes a while to build RPMs. Has a good power spread across the board, did very well on the dyno. It was right about 2nd, 3rd. I got to double check. In the KTM are super close and have very similar characteristics. and just a bike that, like I said, it has a nice spread of power, but just doesn't really come to life anywhere. And that's what a few of the riders mentioned that came in is, hey, it's easy, it's good tractable power, it's really good in hard pack situations. The bike never really seems like it's getting away from you, and because of that, you can really push it towards its limits. At the same time, it just doesn't have the 450 characteristics. It doesn't really have that bark, that response off the bottom that sometimes you're looking for in certain situations. It doesn't really just get up and snap out of a corner up a jump face quite as much as some of the air bikes in the class. And for a lot of the guys, when you're jumping between all the machines, it just feels like it leaves something wanting. It's definitely got plenty of power. It's just a really different characteristic. Moving over into the bodywork and the chassis, it really depends on the rider. A lot of the smaller guys like this bike. It's got an extremely low bar. The seat to foot peg height is a little bit compact on it. It's very small for those guys. The taller guys really said they were struggling with the overall rider triangle feeling very compact, kind of trapping them in on the bike. And then there is some split decision on the bodyworks. The chrome ollie frame and the bodywork makes it the only bike like is like the KTM. There's a little bit difference in where you grip it and where you have control of the bike. We have a few guys that did like the overall layout of the machine, said it was easy to hold on to, and we had one or two that were struggling a little bit with the placements and kind of those grip areas and how they worked for their riding style. Moving over to the frame, we talked about a little bit on the KTM about it feeling a little bit rigid up at the headstay. The Husky has a similar frame feel, but really the suspension characteristic is a lot different. This is the first year for the US setting. I guess I got backtracked a little bit to give you guys a little bit more detail. So the Husqvarna is what they call a world spec, meaning the bike that we ride here in this test is the same one sold in Europe, Australia, down South America. The spec's the same. Now with the KTM, the US spec is uniquely its own. Sometimes that is tire choice. It's been transmission gear ratio choice in past couple years, I believe in Europe, and I'm not sure. I think they may still have a 4-speed, but they definitely have in the past. Well, we've had a 5. Different suspension settings, different muffler, etc. But usually the US spec on the KTM and the world spec on the Huskies are very similar. This is the first year they've really given Husky a lot more leeway on their development to get away from that. So the suspension settings on this bike are very unique to it. Its valving spec is, its base air pressure is 0.2 or 0.3 bar less. So a pretty good PSI of spring rate, air spring difference there. And the shock spring is also a rate lower on the Husky. And then for what some people don't realize is, while the main frame is the same, of course, we got a completely different subframe unit. The carbon composite subframe flexes a bit more. And then also this swing arm is different on the Husky. They may look the same at first glance, but this casting line here is quite a bit different on the Husky. There's more flex in this swing arm, and overall, that brings in a little bit more of a comfortable machine. And that's why guys end up usually rating it higher than the KTM. For the majority of our group, other than one rider, which we'll get to a little bit later, thought the Husky was a better overall package. With the KTM, we were commenting about how the chassis was really rigid and precise. It has more comfort than, say, the Honda or the Suzuki. They're overall rigid, but maybe not as much as it could use, and it just felt a little bit uncomfortable in places, a little bit harder to set up, a little bit harder to get that comfort across the range of the tracks. Where the Husky, even though it has the same mainframe, you don't feel a lot of that. There is still a little bit of rigidity in the clamps and bars. Big one though is the bars on these are different than the KTM. I believe the KTM bar is made by Neckin, the Husky one is made by Pro Taper. There's a little bit more flex up there, a little more comfort. But just the suspension settings alone make the Husky settle a lot more. It conforms to the track. The KTM feels a lot more like it's kind of bouncing across the top of braking bumps going a corner, where the Husky settles more in between it and offers more comfort, and it's just more compliant from track to track. Like I said, you would think maybe across a range of riders that might be a lack if it's a little soft, a little even wallowing in places, but it better matches the power characteristic. The KTM confused some riders because it had a really aggressive chassis and a really aggressive ergonomic feel, but the motor was so mellow that it kind of had, like I said, a split personality is what I termed it in the KTM video. The Husky, the chassis and motor character match each other a lot better. It's why I consider very good, I hate to use the term vet bike, but kind of in that sense, because it is really mellow. It doesn't really get away from you. The chassis is forgiving and the motor is forgiving, and the suspension on this bike is more forgiving, and just gives it a balanced character between chassis, suspension, and motor. They all kind of match. and it just makes it easier to know how to ride the bike. Yeah, it feels, like I said, a little soft, a little wobbly when you're really pushing your pace, but the rest of the time it's very forgiving, and it also makes it an easy bike to ride over the length of the moto. You feel like you can ride it very close to its potential. Like I said, the motor itself, though, is the most mellow out of this group. It just doesn't have that bark off the bottom. It's lacking a bit of connection feel. So there's a little bit of a almost delay feel to the throttle response, even though they've also changed the mapping. The airbox different side plate for this one is a much smaller difference than the KTM's one. It's just these tiny slits up on the top of the panel, but it still does come with 2 optional airbox panels. We mostly ran the slitted one. Most of the guys like that. The RPM build character on the Husky is a little bit more mellow, or a little bit slower revving even than the KTM from that low to mid range, but it does pull through very far. If you want to rev it, this bike will pull pretty far for a 450, but it's just going to be a slower overall characteristic. Like I said, the chassis, one of the weird things ergonomically, I'll reiterate it, tall guys complain about the bars, and the one that was kind of a consensus across the group is pretty much nobody liked the stock seat cover on this bike. It is brutal, and we've been saying that for the past couple years. The gripper material they use is different than the gripper material I usually put on a seat. I don't know if it's the way the base is designed, the foam and the gripper cover itself, but it's a little bit abusive to your backside, to put it bluntly. And most of the guys noticed when they got this that certain area of your body felt a little more worn than it should have. Like I said, though, adjustment-wise from track to track, it's a lot easier to set up than KTM. It definitely fell probably middle field for that. The Yamaha has the most overall comfort to the bike while still having a bit of a held-up aggressive nature. The Husky still holds some of the precision from the KTM, from that style frame, so it has great turn-in response. It has great roll character from entrance, middle to exit. The front has great grip, which is interesting because it's not a very when you go to the weight bias of the bikes, because of the air fork, it doesn't actually have that much weight on the front end, but it just has a very precise feel. It doesn't have the same level of comfort as, say, as the Yamaha, or maybe even the fork on the Cowie, but it's definitely better than the Suzuki, the KTM, and in some situations it could be a little bit better than the Honda. A little bit vague initially, like an air fork is, but the overall movement of the stroke is pretty good, albeit a bit soft, and that's what some of the faster guys in the group were commenting about, is the overall soft nature of the suspension. But unlike the Cowie, where the fork is soft and the shock rides high, the Husky is overall soft, so it squats evenly through the stroke, so even when you're blowing through a little bit, the whole bike is settling down. It's not pitching a lot, which can happen if, like I said, if you end up with one end that's a little bit stiffer or softer in the air, they feel equally soft, so the bike at least maintains its balance. So even when it blows through, it's a little bit easier to maintain how the bike is working when it stays level. Like I said, but what it mostly comes down to, the negativity why I didn't get placed any higher, is everybody felt like it was a little bit of a harder bike to push on because of the mellow nature. Like I said, it's kind of a weird way. I'm being a little bit contradictory, where guys say it's easier to feel like you're getting the bike to its limit, but at the same time, it doesn't inspire them a lot of confidence to keep going to that limit because of the softness. You just know you're getting through what the bike feels like it's capable of, and it makes it a little bit harder to want to go that extra mile at times. We're going to jump into a few of the riders' comments, a little bit of their finishing positions and weight and everything. I know a lot of people, of course, always like to hear Jeff Walker's comment. Jeff placed this 4th. He is, I believe he's the only rider in this group that did rank it below the KTM. And at his pace, some of the precision of the KTM chassis and stiffer suspension helped him. He was one, if you like, the one guy in the group, because of his size and speed, that the benefit of the Husky being softer did not help him. So he rated it 4th. We're going to go through some of his notes. His good points: super smooth motor. You can ride aggressively even when you're tired without worrying about getting that whiskey throttle or letting it get away from you. It sticks in ruts very well, and it settles really well. Once again, that soft chassis, that softer suspension, it squats and settles down into the ruts, especially when we're on the hard pack tracks that don't really have much of an entry rut, so you can't just throw the bike into it. You're having to roll in easy. It doesn't stay too high in the stroke. It settles down those ruts and you get really good traction. The soft chassis combined with the tame motor makes it an amazing bike on hard pack tracks with square edges. Once again, that chassis and motor combination are really matched together. They kind of accentuate each other, and they're really complementary of each other. You really, once again, like the hydro clutch on this better than the KTM. The bad, super full capital, low bars, no forward bar mount position for him, which was a struggle. Forks are a little sketchy under hard braking through the rough stuff. They bottom out pretty hard. Like he's saying, it's just for his speed, there's just not a lot of end stroke hold up. There's not enough progression. It's a little too linear for him. There's not enough spike to hold it up in the stroke. Despite how light it is, the weak motor makes it feel pretty heavy in areas. Now, this is something I've talked about in some of the other videos, and people always say, like, how can you say that the Yamaha or the Honda at the high end of the scale feel light? And I'll reiterate what I said in our video. West Coast to East Coast is going to throw us off. Of course, we do all of our testing on the West Coast. I'd love to do East Coast. I already buy all the bikes. It's pretty expensive. So this channel keeps going. We're going to try to get out there, but it was already a lot of money to do this. Speaking of which, if you want to support the cause, we're getting ready into 250 shots. I have a Patreon giving away some cool prizes and stuff. If you want to throw in a couple bucks, patreon.com/ML512. Once again, link below in description. If you want to throw in a couple dollars, win a few cool prizes, help us keep doing this stuff. But back to what I was saying about those conditions. When you're West Coast, there isn't a lot of situations where you're throwing the bike into berms, when you're really all over the bike fighting it through loose material. You're flowing a lot more. When you're doing that flow motion and rolling your momentum, you're not really having to physically fight the bike. So as long as all the mass is centered and the motor doesn't have a lot of inertia, the bike will feel light out here until you go to throw it off a jump. And even then, we have jump faces with ruts. We're able to kind of let the bike slide up a hard pack face. So yeah, that weight isn't a big deal. Now, where you would notice on West Coast is dealing with little singles on the inside corners, undulations where you're trying to wheelie the bike over something or blip through some braking bumps. Quick, snappy throttle response can kind of do the work for you. You can blip the throttle and the bike will leap over something as long as it has enough response. The KTM and Husky have these motors that are very, like I said, mellow, and there's not a lot of quick build of the RPM. So there's situations where you blip the throttle instead of the bike leaping to life, it just kind of tractors through it. So then you're having to physically pull on the bike to replicate that effect. All of a sudden you're doing more physical work. Now, the bit I've gotten to ride, I got to ride Husky on East Coast last year at Alden Baker's, sand rollers and stuff. A little bit I've ridden a KTM or Husky bike at all on East Coast. The physical weight starts to make a difference when you're constantly all over the bike and pulling on, moving on it. That's where their physical weight comes into play. But in the conditions we have out here, it doesn't end up feeling like that because of the motor. The motor character can actually make the bike feel heavier than it really is. That's one big one where a lot of the guys are like, hey, the Suzuki's only a pound lighter, heavier than the Yamaha. Why do you all say it's so heavy? It has, even though it has a little more response, it also has a very heavy engine braking character. That motor loads the chassis a lot, so it can make the bike physically feel heavier than it, either than it is or matches to what its weight really is. For some reason, I found it was difficult to put the front end where I wanted it at times. I think it's because of the chopper out feeling that made the front wander. Once again, soft at his weight, when he'd set back, the bike would squat out a lot. There wasn't a lot of weight on the front end, always on corner entry. And then one last word, all capitals, ugly. Ugly. Well, Jeff, you rode one of these the first 3 nationals. So what does that say about you? But you know, Jeff is 6'1", high 100, what was he? About 170 pounds, I think, when we did this test. 6'1", very lanky build. Once again, that pro Supercross or national level rider. Sorry, he hasn't done any Supercross yet. And that's kind of where his comments come in. Derick Caskey, the next tall guy in the test, also sitting around that 6'1" mark, but he's a little over 190 pounds. He's overall matches his size, big boot size, big hand size, big helmet size. Derick's big guy. He's our vet novice, probably about our 40 novice, likes to jump anything. Doesn't have the greatest cornering speed in the world, so he kind of fits that mark for us. He also rated the bike 4th. Some of his comments. Suspension updates were a big improvement this year. Makes the whole bike feel a lot more forgiving, and it really shined on the roughest tracks. Made it very hard to rate 4th for him. He said it was very close to 3rd on his list. He said just between the motor comment as well, also just overall matches the rest of the character of the bike. The cons, while the Husky did everything fairly good, it just doesn't stand out anywhere. It just doesn't have a character that makes me want it over anything else in the class. Once again, I talked about that earlier a little bit. I'm thinking about this bike. Everybody rode and was okay with it, but nobody wanted to go to it. It was just like, yeah, it's decent everywhere, but you know, I talk about why I think shootouts are important. And once again, the bike that wins, the bike that gets last, I'm not telling you you have to go buy the Yamaha because it won, or you know, you should stay away from the Suzuki because it was 6. The characters of the bike match people, and I always feel like some guys always try to say, oh, just pick a color and ride. Yeah, all these bikes are good to a certain extent where you'll have a good experience on these machines. But I run into all times, I have buddies that jump bikes every year, a good local group of vet guys that, you know, make good enough that they change bikes once a year, once every other year. And it's interesting when somebody finds the bike that suits them, though, how much better the experience can be. And that's what we're trying to cover in these shootouts, is give you guys all the info for you that are going to go out there and make an informed decision and make a purchase this year. Because so there are bikes that are going to have a neutral characteristic, and then there are bikes that are going to have a good and bad characteristic. And what's interesting is that good characteristic could either accentuate what you already do and make the experience better, or it could help you in an area that it hurts. And that's where I said last 2 years, some of the difficult choices for me between first and second has been identifying which bike helps me where I'm bad and rounds out my riding experience the most. And that's the problem, is the Husky, even though it's a metal character, it doesn't have a standout character that might accentuate or help a rider in a certain situation. Myself, of course, I rated it 3rd on my list this year, once again, because I value a little bit of that ease of setup. So when it came down to it, it's hard. I say all the time, I bleed green, but the Cowie's finicky out of the box. It's got bad suspension balance. I do like the motor on it better and the chassis overall, but the Husky was just good across all 3 days. Not standout, it's just good across all 3 days. So once again, that sentiment of I like that the motor, the chassis, and the suspension character of this bike all match each other really well. And that's something that gave it a 3rd place for me. Is, once again, nothing stood out, but I didn't feel like I was looking, oh, you know, it's really good here, but just horrible in this stat, in this characteristic. The ergos suit me for my size. I'm about 5'8", 5'9" on a good day, 160 pounds, short arms, short legs. Yeah, the characteristics overall were pretty decent for me. What would I like? Of course, I'd like a bike that has more response. If I'm gonna be on a 450, I want a motor that snaps more to life. I want that power. If I wanted a characteristic this mellow, I'd go ride a 350. So that was kind of my standout issue with it, is mostly down to the engine character and a little bit of the ergos. Once again, not a terrible fan of some of the new side plate designs. The seat, it's not as comfortable as maybe a couple other bikes in class for me in those situations. Zack Petty, our other pro-level rider in the group, has raced some nationals and supercross the last couple years. He's 5'7", maybe 5'8", 150 pounds, definitely the smallest guy in the group. His comments were similar to his KTM ones. Once again, the ergos for him worked really well on this bike. But even at his height, he said he felt like the bars are still maybe a tad bit low. Even for his smaller frame. They say kind of trap you in that hunk down position. I think there's definitely a balance between having too tall of a bar that gets you upright and one that's too low that you get stuck down on the front of the bike. You kind of have to have that right in the middle so you can feel like you can move around the bike and transfer your weight as needed. Once again, he was a bigger fan of, even at his speed, but because of his size, the suspension settings on this were better than some of the other bikes in class, but the motor character overall didn't do it for him either. Landed in 3rd for him. Last one, Maddox Soto, my kind of default B-level local kid, top 5 B-level rider. He's only been off little bikes for about 2 years now. First time I've actually stuck him in a 450 shootout, so he had a very fresh opinion on all the bikes. He rated it 3rd as well. We're going to go over a couple of his comments. Pros, actually one of the funny ones, he mentioned this, is the inward pegs. The KTM and the Husky pegs set up a little bit, and they kind of naturally pinch your legs up a little bit because they're dog-eared up, so they kind of pinch in likes. He said really like that feeling, the way it allowed him to grip on the bike. But he also said at the same time, he wasn't a fan of this rear section of the bike, the way his leg was gripping it, and the way once again, somebody wasn't a big fan of the seat cover and the grip of it. He said, same the rest of it's just an overall comfortable bike. Nothing stood out. Chassis was comfortable, all right, didn't stand out on any specific turning characteristic. Motor didn't stand out in any point, but wasn't bad. Suspension was a little bit soft overall, but definitely comfortable in most situations. So that kind of covers it for the group of riders. I'm going to go over a couple little things, I guess, on the sense of, you know, what would I do if I was going to go out and get one of these bikes? What would I recommend? The bar position, the bar selection is going to be big depending upon the size of rider. When Jeff Walker rode one of these in outdoors, I got a set of IMS 5mm down, 5mm back pegs for him, and he said that was a huge difference because before that he was trying to run bar risers, and he said it didn't really work for him in the corners. Being that he's mostly legs, I pulled his bar risers out, made him try the different pegs. I think the pegs are maybe $160, $180, and he said those were a huge difference. Another big one I would look at into is remap, try to get a little more response out of the bike. It's definitely not going to make the motor character the same as some of the Japanese models, but I've definitely tried some stock ECUs remapped on this bike. Twisted Development does a really good one. They're right across the street from the KTM Husky guys, so they work with a lot of the employees and stuff and have done their bikes. A good amount of response, a good amount of connection. It's still not going to make it just absolutely bark to life like the Honda or the Yamaha, but it's going to get a lot more connection and get you a lot more feel for that motor and get it to respond a little more accurately to your motions. I think that is a huge difference on this bike. And then suspension wise, like I said, lean more towards the vet guy and the lighter guy. The suspension's probably going to work if you're a bit faster, a bit heavier. You're probably going to have to do some level of setup to this bike to get the bottoming resistance you're going to need overall. And really from there, man, the stock clutch is really good. All the brake stuff's really good. The engine just totally depends on what you think of its stock. You might do an exhaust system, a couple different, of course, options out there with different feels, maybe something else to the motor. Once again, 450s, yeah, they have a ton stock, but the way you place the character could still be a big difference. That's where I say like a pipe ECU, just to be able to manipulate where that power is, would be my biggest recommendation. The other one is the stock seat cover going. Once again, nobody really cared for that in the group. That would be something I would swap out pretty much right off the bat. So like I said, it's not really a big list. So once again, some people might go, well, if it's only has a couple things, why didn't do better? It's just still how the characteristics suit the rider, and the characteristics it has doesn't always place it up that high. But once again, it is a really good bike, and it can be a really good bike for the right dude. If that's, you know, what we're saying about it, kind of the rounded character, if that sounds like it's for you, then go check one out. Once again, if you guys have been watching these series and like it, please give us a subscribe, a thumbs up. That's a huge help. We're getting ready to jump into 250, so make sure you stay tuned to the channel. We've got some other really big announcements coming up next month. I was a little slow to get this week because I was pretty much in meetings all week. We have something really, really cool and exciting for next year. Put it this way, Supercross season is going to be an extremely busy project for something fun we're working on. So we're hoping to announce that in the next few weeks. Like I said, if you get a chance, check out the Patreon, follow me on Instagram, check out some of the brands here, give them a follow or shout out, and a big thanks for watching.